Hi everybody, so welcome back maybe to those who joined us yesterday, and for those who's your first time to join us, this is the second of 3 webinars as part of the FLA Forum. For people who may not be aware, the FLA Forum is an event that we've run every year for the last 11 years, and it is a day that we take some time out to consider all the issues that are facing our industry. The FLA Forum is brought to you by the Galway Film FLA, the RAP Fund, and we've also had great support from Screen Ireland, the Galway Film Centre, Screen Skills Ireland, and Creative Europe Media Desk. And particularly this session today, we've worked very closely with ACE producers. So thank you to Jacobine, Al, Meijin, and of course, Simon there. So today we're going to talk about co-production in the time of Corona. And if anyone has any comments and they want to share them on social media, the hashtag is FLAForum. We actually were trending yesterday in Ireland. So that was a great coup. So it'll be great to do that again today. So do please share your thoughts online. And we will have a Q&A at the end. So if people do want to submit questions, there's a Q&A function. It could be at the top or the bottom of your screen here. I'll come back on towards the end of the session. We've got about 45, 50 minutes for this chat. And then I'll be able to distribute those questions to our panelists. So as I said, Thursday is traditionally always the day we've had the FLA Forum at the Galway Film FLA. And I said we've moved virtual this year, so it's great to be able to do that and continue to have that tradition. And actually, it's great to have the man at the helm today, Mr. Simon Perry, who I worked alongside for many, many years at the FLA Forum. So it's great that today is his day for this session as well. And also, no better man to talk about co-production. I think throughout his career at the head of numerous film funds and through his work at the ACE Producers Network, he has always placed co-production and that model and championed it at the heart of everything that he's done. So I think no better man to maybe manage our conversation today. We have some great panelists. We're coming to you from Dublin, London, Hamburg, and Paris. So without further ado, I'd ask our panelists maybe to switch on their mics, and I'll introduce you to Mr. Simon Perry to lead the conversation and chair. And I'll pop back on towards the end, and hopefully you can submit some questions. But we're going to have a good think about what co-production means and has the results of what has happened the last couple of months and what that means for us. So Simon, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. Nice to be back in Galway, even if it's only virtually. Great to see you all. I'm happy to tell you that I'm joined here by people who know even more about co-production than I do. That's the idea here. And we're going to talk about what's facing the co-producers that we aspire to be as we come out of this pandemic crisis. I'm going to start just by saying a few things to set the scene, if you like, about independent production generally. And then we'll get into specifically talking about co-production when I've done that. But what we know, I mean, this much we know about what coronavirus means for the present and the future of independent production, I would say. The first thing, which I'm sure everybody knows, is that production costs are going to be higher. Protocols are being introduced which govern how people will work on the set and how they will interact with each other and be able to work together. And the implications of these protocols is unquestionably that the cost of making films is going to go up, mainly because of the extra time that's needed, but also to some extent because of the extra personnel that are going to be needed. So we're talking about films costing more. That's the first thing. The second thing, which has been preoccupying producers enormously across Europe, is in the independent sector, is the question of insurance. Because commercial insurers will not cover production risks arising out of the coronavirus. And it's impossible to secure for an independent production a completion bond. So there are various things being done about this, but it's a problem which is facing independent production everywhere. It doesn't face the majors in the same way. They can decide whether to take these risks themselves. But for us, putting together piecemeal film financing, which is then going to have to be cash flowed into production, insurance is absolutely basic to it, and it's very much threatened. It's not available, largely not available at the moment in the present situation. And then there's the question of the financing. I'm thinking particularly of the market money. We all know that over the last 20 years, the money coming from the market with which to finance films has been falling. It's been falling for a whole lot of reasons we don't need to go into now. We know them very well. But now it's taking a steep dive down, you can be sure, because all the cinemas have been closed for 4 months. They're only going to come out of being closed very slowly. And the traditional forms of distribution are very much threatened in terms of the resources that they have to offer, to be involved in, in production of independent films. So what was already a difficult situation with a shortage of market money is now going to be really crucial over the coming months, perhaps a year, perhaps even more. That's something we should look at in a moment in greater detail as it affects co-production. The fourth thing and final thing I would mention as part of the general landscape is actually a bit of good news, because the one area of production which is essentially unaffected by the coronavirus situation is animation. And animation, if there are two big winners in our industry out of the coronavirus, it's the platform, the streaming platforms and animators. And animation, almost all of which is done through co-production, is largely unaffected and largely unexposed to the production problems that live action has. That's just looking at where independent production finds itself. And what I want to explore in this session are the questions of whether and to what extent international co-productions are worse hit than locally made films, or are they better equipped to resist the difficulties? And three people who know a lot about this, because they do it all the time, are with me. Rebecca O'Brien, who is without doubt the most experienced co-producer in the UK. For 25 years, she's been co-producing Ken Loach's films and films by other directors as well. David Collins, who is, I would say, unquestionably the most experienced producer in Ireland, and actually, therefore, the most experienced co-producer. He's been producing and co-producing films since the early 1980s. And from Germany, I'm joined by Helge Albers, an ace producer, by the way, who has headed German companies, Flying Moon, and more recently, Achtung Panda. He's very good at dreaming up names for his companies, by the way. And these are companies which have been prolific co-producers. Achtung Panda actually, I think, was set up, or certainly had a focus, has a strong focus on German-Chinese co-productions. But Helge did what I did at a certain point in my career, which is that he switched from being a producer to being a funder. And he's now running the Hamburg Film Fund. He's been doing it for just over a year. And the Hamburg Film Fund is probably of all the funds in Germany, not the largest, but I would say definitely the one that's been consistently most committed to funding international co-productions. First of all, I'm going to ask each one of you, I'm going to ask Rebecca first, what's going on in your life at the moment in the way of co-production? What were you doing when the crisis arrived? What have you been doing during? What measures are you taking to deal with some of the problems that the coronavirus is presenting you with?
Okay, so first up, we were hoping to do a probably final Ken Loach film this summer, the third in the Newcastle trilogy, but sadly that has had to go out the window. It's a summer film, and so we would have wanted to shoot it in August. That would have been a co-production, and we would have done it the usual way with France and Belgium, but obviously with Ken being quite a grand old gentleman now at the age of 84, he sort of had to be shielding for the last few weeks. And so, you know, the thing that's really affected us is the fact that the way we make films involves being close to people and meeting a lot of people in the course of research and preparing it. And so that's just out of the question for a Ken Loach film until we have a vaccine, until there's a proper system, until we're living with the virus. So if we are able to ever do the film, it would be next year. So, however, I've been busy developing and getting quite far along the way with a couple of projects that I've been cooking for a while. And one of the good things about the lockdown is that there have been less distractions, and I've been able to get really deeply into the sort of budgeting and scheduling and scripting of a couple of projects. One is a film set probably in Scotland based on a British book. It hasn't been announced yet, but it will be probably end up being a German, British, Greek co-production, and I'm hoping to make that next year. And then I've got a film I've been developing for ages called Catch the Moon, which is a romantic comedy set in Gaza, and that will be a French, Belgium, Luxembourg, Jordanian, Palestinian, British co-production, and it's something I've been treasuring for a long time, and it's a lovely film. And actually, during the lockdown, we've really moved on, and we've been doing budgets and applying. I mean, the other thing we've been able to do is apply to funds, and that's sometimes quite difficult when you're running around the office. So, but the final thing that I've been lucky enough to get is I've been in touch with a French company who has offered me a film which will shoot in Scotland in November, and it's a remake, and it's something that will be a 3-week shoot. And it's frankly a gift, because it's pretty much funded and it's going to happen, and we can shoot it in a bubble. It all takes place in about a 10-mile radius. So it's a very doable film, because you can bubble yourselves and go off and do it. And it will be a very intense experience, but I'm all for an intense experience to round off the year, given how difficult it's been. So that will be a French-British co-production, and so in a way, my coronavirus lockdown has not been bad. It's been awful to watch I mean, the independent British scene is pretty bad at the moment. Funding is getting more and more difficult. Public funding is still there, but beyond that, it's very difficult. And I think the coronavirus adding to the cost of things will make it more difficult. And the independent sector was already on its uppers, not helped by the rise of the studio films in this country, and the rise of high-end TV, which have basically robbed us of a lot of our assets. So it's very difficult to get an independent production off the ground. But luckily, because I've got long-term associations with European partners, they think of me when they're making something. And so I'm working, but I'm really not sure. I think a lot of independent film people in the UK are definitely going to TV, and definitely it's very, very febrile.
It's noticeable, Rebecca, from what you're saying, that although you've had to postpone Ken Loach's film, and you say you can't really consider making it until next year, everything else you're planning and everything else you're putting together, you're doing it as a co-production. So it sounds as if you're not deterred at all from the principle of co-production. And I'd like to come back later on to talk a bit more about this film that you're doing in Scotland, which I didn't know about. But when you talk about
probably can't tell you anything about it, because
well, there's one aspect of it I think interesting, is when you say you're making it in a bubble, and you're making it as it were for 3 weeks, a bit like a local Scottish film, I guess. And we talk about the implications. One of the big implications of co-production is that people may have to travel. And the question of traveling raises questions of insurance, questions also of cost, but particularly of exposure, closed borders, and those kind of things. And it's an element, an aspect of co-production that I'd like us to come back and talk more about. But thanks really a lot. David, will you join us now? And what's the situation at Samson and in your life as a producer? What have you been planning? What have you had to abandon? What have you had to postpone? What's going on?
Okay, so I think the first thing is, unlike some of my colleagues, I was really lucky, and I dodged a bullet on sort of two productions which we had just completed shooting on earlier in the year before any of this happened. So, and then they both involve small amounts of reshooting, and I'm really glad that we got all of those done. So most of my time since March has been spent supervising the release, along with my co-producers, of 3 films. One is a low-budget kind of art house movie called Rose Plays Julie, which played initially in the London Film Festival and then in the Dublin Festival, and is actually screening in Galway. A second one, which is also screening in Galway, and it's turned out actually to be a world premiere, is a film called The Castle, which is screening tomorrow. And again, mercifully, we weren't shooting, therefore we didn't have to postpone or anything else like that. Unlike a number of my colleagues, there's at least kind of 3, if not 4 films that had started shooting and had to stop. You know, and I just think that has proved extremely difficult. I mean, all the public funders have been, as you would expect, extremely supportive, but there's a limit. There's like a limit in terms of what they can do, and there is a nervousness surrounding starting again while the insurance situation is so unclear. I was quite lucky. I'd received media funding from Creative Europe towards the end of last year. And then recently I got slate funding from Screen Ireland. So I'm just wondering, is there any other source of slate funding I can get? And, you know, I'd have sort of 3 slates packed up on top of one another, which would be a lovely place to be. A bit like Rebecca, we've been able to do kind of a deep dive into the 12 to 15 projects that we have on our slate. And partly that has involved actually kind of stepping back from 1 or 2 things that have been kind of sitting there quietly, which kind of aren't going to go anyplace, but it gave us a chance to gently let them go, which is, you know, and that takes time. I mean, you know, I think when you take on a project, you're being the custodian of somebody else's dream, and you have to be respectful, I think, of how you deal with that. From a financial point of view, then, you know, Samson has been able to kind of manage on the, you know, the delivery fees that it's getting from the various funders on its projects. And then we have one film which we are trying to place. It's a co-production with a company in the UK called Tempesta Films, with a brilliant Italian producer called Carlo Crestodina. It's a first Irish feature. It's a debut. It's Kathy Brady, called Wildfire, funded by Screen Ireland, BFI, Film 4, etc. And we're just waiting to hear from an A-list festival that we hope to hear from early next week to see where it'll go. But again, if that film goes, it may well be in, you know, like a digital universe, which is a shame. I mean, I do feel that it's really hard, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the film out there, you're trying to get it reviewed, but it's very difficult, or certainly I don't think it's easy for independent feature films. Like, part of a producer's job is to try to build the reputation of what you produce. And I think, you know, to have the physical cinema there is really important. A bit like Simon. I mean, I'm looking at maybe getting sort of 2 projects off the ground by the end of the year. One is in effect a service co-production. I mean, I might have a small equity stake in it, which is just to cover a shortfall. And the other is a reasonable scale Finnish-Irish co-production with a director from Finland, and this is his first English language feature. And we hope to shoot that in the west of Ireland for 6 to 7 weeks, which might now have to become 8 weeks. And it's with an older cast, so the 3 leads are over 60 years old, which again creates
insurance.
It's certain issues. We don't have anyone who's 84 in a senior role on the film. So we're just working through that. We have funding from all the usual sources. We're just casting it at the moment. A couple of our cast are, fairly high profile from the UK. And we have that whole thing about, well, how will we travel them in? How will we deal with it? I mean, it is interesting from the insurance perspective. I mean, it's kind of a technical thing, but there are some people now who are beginning to offer sort of cast insurance. In other words, that you can kind of buy out. It's called where you buy out the COVID exclusion. You buy out the COVID exclusion. And so what this is let's say you have your lead cast, the director, possibly the camera person, like those people who are essential for making the film. And there are people now who are offering for quite a lot of money to sort of buy out sort of those exclusions up to a certain amount of money. So the current quotes which are floating around, just so that you're aware of these. Now, these may change on a weekly basis, but, some sort of low budget films have been quoted kind of £5,000 sterling to buy out a director on what is effectively a really personal feature doc project. And another quote which I saw recently was £100,000 sterling to effectively to buy out the COVID exclusion on essential elements, which were 3 cast and 4 HODs. £100,000. And
Rebecca,
but that's
Rebecca,
not for abandonment. That's not for abandonment. That's just to sort of cover your weekly shooting costs, you know what I mean, while you determine what, if anything, you can do in the meantime. So it's not abandonment insurance, which is a technical term.
Right. Rebecca, did you want to come in there?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, we, PACT, the producers organisation in the UK, have been working very hard trying to get something from the government to break this deadlock. And I think, in a way, without insurance, we're not going anywhere. And I'm hoping and that my work will be predicated on there being the insurance issue being sorted out to one way or another by the time we actually get going. I think it's essential. I mean, we can't film without it.
There are various options going around at the moment. It's a possibility to have a bond here in France, and there's a little scheme in the Netherlands. We'll come back to those things, if you will, in a moment. David, thank you for that. Just a question about the Tempesta co-production. Is that a film that you're still completing,
No.
Or is it something that's ready to go and you're looking for a
it's completed. It's completed.
I see.
It's all done. We're just waiting for a reaction from 1 or 2 of the A-list kind of places, all of whom actually have trimmed their programs immensely anyway. Yeah. So it's even harder to get in to a scenario which isn't as exciting as it would have been in a pre-lockdown.
Good.
Scenario.
Listen, thank you very much. We'll come back to that. And I noticed from what Rebecca told us about her slate, that you're still perfectly gaily planning your future films as international co-productions, just as usual.
Absolutely.
So we'll come back to talk perhaps a bit more about some of the precautions you're taking or how you see that actually being feasible. Helge, tell us what's going on in Hamburg and in Germany, from a point of view of a funder, of course, but from any point of view, production that you're involved in or have had to postpone or whatever. How's it been going?
Well, I mean, from a funder's point of view, we're receiving a lot of dialogue and requests from the production side. So when COVID hit, we prioritized staying functional as a fund, as an organization, which had a couple of challenges in itself. B, dealing with the immediate difficulties that were clearly visible: closed down cinemas, shut down productions, basically rolling back all the activity that you can see on different ends of the industry. That was an important part. At the same time, we were introducing new guidelines on 1st of April, which we have basically worked on for the past year. We introduced new juries on the 1st of April, and that under the pretext of COVID was a challenge in itself. Well, on the other end, we tried, and that's a signal we received from the producers, to remain functional as a fund. There were a couple of funds like Eurymarsch, like the German Federal Fund and so on, who postponed funding sessions, which was quite disruptive and created a lot of difficulties in the financing strategies of producers, created a lot of uncertainty on the producers' sides. And what we heard and understood very well was that having a sense of continuity is a very important thing in times of uncertainty. So we basically stuck to our funding deadlines and our funding decision-making times. We introduced a couple of new programs. So we spent most of March and April raising money for the different funding programs. One was an additional slate funding program for our regional producers here, which we have 3x3, which is basically a slate for 3 projects within 3 years, where all of the overheads of that slate can be recovered on the first project. So we try to allow a large chunk of the overhead and the operational money within a slate to be allocated at a very early stage when it's needed during the COVID crisis. We raised money for the cinemas and for the loss that the cinemas made for closing down. It's an ongoing process that's still happening, and we're looking into new programs at the moment to sort of compensate for the losses that are happening in cinemas still. And last but not least, we also set up a joint fund with all the German regional funds and with the federal fund to ease the additional costs on ongoing productions that had to be stopped. So that affected co-productions as well as German national productions. So every production that was hit by COVID had additional costs. We covered to a certain amount, plus television was a part of it and so on. So I think it recovered most of the damages that were done by the immediate COVID problems in that part. And we are now looking into the insurance challenge. I mean, that's obviously something we also got addressed very early on. We became aware after the first shock of the cinemas. It's a very obvious and easy story to tell. The cinemas are shut down. There's a big crisis. Everybody understands that. To communicate the difficulty of an insurance situation to politics is something that takes a little bit more time, is a little bit more difficult. So we managed now to install a 50 million euro aid fund for insurances on the federal level, and as Germany is a federal state, each of the regions will contribute to hopefully arrive at a 100 million euro fund at the end of the day to basically cover insurance risks that were already mentioned before. So that's a work in progress. We're still in contact with the other funds to work on that, but that's sort of the direction things are going. Well, otherwise, we're back on track with our funding sessions. We continue funding co-productions as we did before. And the producers keep developing co-productions. On the production side, I think co-productions are harder hit than regional productions, local productions by COVID, simply because of traveling, communication, and coordination of different parties who have different policies and a different set of regulations. So it's obviously much more complicated to get projects off the ground and get them together. But that's in a nutshell, that's the situation we're looking at here. You need to switch on your mic, Simon.
Sorry. In terms of your resources, are you looking at a situation where, for example, over the next 12 months, you're going to be having less money than you would have because you have had to pay more to complete films and help production companies now?
No, thankfully not. All the immediate recovery programs that we have set up, like the state funding, like the federal funding, our part of the federal money, etc. For the cinemas, where we received additional money from the city of Hamburg and the region of Schleswig-Holstein, which are our two shareholders. So we didn't need to cut from our regular budget, basically.
Okay, I mean, it's good to hear that you are still committed to funding co-productions, because I do know of a number of funds up and down Europe that are thinking more and more about targeting their resources, their support more onto local production, and perhaps making less money available for, as it were, other people's films. And also, when it comes to where the money has to be spent, there's an expectation that film agencies, film funds are going to require a more precise targeting of the money to local expenditure. Some do it, some don't, but there's an expectation that some will drift more towards that, which could mean a kind of introverting, a sort of turning in of the funding available from public funds onto local funds, and there being less for co-production. That, it doesn't sound as if that affects you, but are you aware of that?
I see the tendency. I've heard about funds who are leading that way. I can't confirm it from our end. I mean, our expectations in regional expenditure haven't changed from before COVID to now. We look very carefully into the profiles of the producers who apply, and obviously we are judging the projects in a similar way that we judged them before. Yeah, I can't really report any major shifts in the way we look at projects at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
One other question. I mean, since we all agree that production costs are going to go up, do you anticipate, as I think some funds do, that this is going to mean funding fewer projects in the future, but having to provide more for each project?
Yeah, possibly it might. You know, I mean, we have a limited budget per year, and if projects become more expensive and those costs have to be spent, have to be recovered by public funding, it's gonna be a strain on our funding budget. So it might be the case then that we can only fund fewer projects if we have to spend more money on the project. We begin to understand what the amount, how complicated it is to actually understand what the additional costs are on each project, because each project is highly individual, and what it requires in resources, in terms of spacing on the sets, in terms of time resources it takes, in terms of personal resources and so on. Each project is so individual that you can't really generalize, but as you say, each of the films will be more expensive, and we are making this a part of it. We are accepting these costs as a fund. They can be part of the production budgets, and so we need to understand that films, if we fund more expensive films, it might be fewer films.
Okay, I'd like to just come back now in the co-production context to talk more about insurances and what can be done, what is being done. I mean, the only alternative to, the only option if the commercial insurers won't take the risk is that in some way the state has to be asked to help. I know of a decision by the CNC, the Centre National de Cinématographie here in France. They have a scheme whereby they will take the risk of the whole completion of the whole film, except for 10%. Producer has to cover 10%, but they will cover 90%. But as far as I'm aware, this is for French films. I'm not sure how available that is to cover risks abroad. There's also another scheme which has been launched, I think now in the Netherlands, by an ace producer called Koji Nelson. And this is a limited insurance. It actually provides cover against non-appearance of actors. That's all it does. It's based on the idea that, you know, crew members and so on can be substituted, but if an actor falls sick, disappears, you have an essential elements issue, which is going to be visible. And this is a non-appearance of actors cover. It's a risk that it takes. And the cost is 0.75% of the budget. And it's matched, in this case, by the Netherlands Film Fund. So actually it's costed at 1.5% of the budget, half of which is covered by the state effectively. Now, again, I'm not sure to what extent that is transferable or extendable to cover risks abroad. Could any of you talk about what you know of what is being done or can be done to make sure that insurances can be given that are useful for co-productions, given the fact that co-productions always mean a film is made in more than one country? Where does the insurance, where is it based? Where does it come from? Does it cover cross-border risks, as it were? What's going on in PACT in the UK, Rebecca? What stage are you at with that?
I'm less involved in PACT now, but I do know that deep discussions are going on with the Treasury about it. It does seem to be like it's considered very important to get production back going again. And I think we're waiting for something to be announced before too long. It's clearly absolutely essential. In terms of the co-production, I think, when you're insuring, like any production, you take a look at the overall project and you know that you're insuring in the place, where the film is going to be made. So we have to have something that works in the UK, that is covered in the UK, even though the thing I'm going to be doing is a French film. It's a major part of the whole shoot will be in the UK, so it has to be covered here. And that's something I will be absolutely investigating. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that something will be sorted within the next couple of months, because otherwise we're not going to be making anything. But I think the will is certainly that production has to get going. As we know, all the economies are trying to get moving again. And so it stands to reason that something must be done. Otherwise you have stasis, and that can't happen. I think one of my bigger fears is actually Brexit and the way that's going to come in and wreck everything anyway.
With your film that you're going to be doing in a bubble in Scotland, is your expectation that the French producer is going to cover the insurance of that film?
It's a conversation we've yet to have, actually. It's still early days, but I would have imagined there will be a conversation about it that will involve both UK and French insurers. I mean, it is ultimately it's a French film, but it will be a co-production. So I think that we have to talk to both sides and see what the best deal we can get is. But we are well aware that the costs will be pushed up to make it work.
is the idea with that project to do the Scottish shoot with an entirely Scottish crew, as if it were a module of a film which is self-contained, or
no?
not?
Because no. I mean, we will be bubbling, as it were, in a specific location, and the people will come from outside. Some will come from France, and some will come from the UK, stroke Scotland. So, but as it as it stands, during prep, we will hopefully get people in, test them, and bubble them there. And it's sort of, in a way, once they've got there, it doesn't matter where they come from. I mean, obviously, I want to get as many Scottish people on it as possible, because then I can try and get a Scottish spend advantage. But no, I don't think. I think as long as you can get there. I mean, ironically, Nicola Sturgeon keeps on threatening to insist on quarantine between England and Scotland. So it may be easier for the French to arrive than me.
No, it's interesting that, because there's been a number of conversations I've been party to recently, and discussions I've heard, which are suggesting that in the future, because of the desirability of limiting travel, in other words, being sure that as few people have to travel as possible, that it may lead to a kind of trend in the planning of co-productions, that if you're shooting a film partly in one country, and then you're doing another bit of the shoot in another country, and maybe post-production in another country, in each country there will be a self-contained crew, a setup, as if it were a module of a film, as it were, which is a module of another film.
You still need the heads of department. You still need the creative elements to be able to move around. I think perhaps that might be the case. I think we should see how it evolves. But it's interesting, because this is a global pandemic, so we're all suffering from it, and to a certain extent in the same way. So my feeling is that as things roll on, I suspect that certain changes will be made. I think that less travel will have to happen, but I don't think it will eliminate it. I think you can't phone in a film. You can't phone in the design elements. You can't. There are certain people who have to be there to make a unique film. So I think that we'll be working on that, and it's going to be very interesting to see how it works.
Yes, I think I absolutely understand, and of course it's weird to imagine you would have a cinematographer change when you go to another country. I mean, this doesn't really work, but people are thinking this way, I think, because it's partly an expectation of there being a second wave, or regional waves, and the possibility of border closures, the possibility of suddenly imposed quarantines, trying to ensure against the effects of that kind of thing. The idea that you need to make sure that, and ideally you're going to perhaps have to make sure that as few people as possible travel. This may create a kind of modular approach to co-production, much more than we have at the moment. It's just, I just throw that out there really, because a number of people are talking about it, and does this preoccupy you, David, at all? Are you planning co-productions in a different way at all, physically?
Yeah. Well, the Finnish one that we've sort of lined up, it's all going to shoot in the west of Ireland, with a crew that is effectively really, at the moment, everyone will be from Ireland. And obviously from a casting point of view, it's very important that we have, really good kind of local picks, even if at the moment they are being offered more as standbys than as, part of the offer to get market money. It is interesting that we have another project which is fairly far advanced, and it's a co-production, this time with Belgium, with a very good Belgian producer called Dries Filpo, who is an ace producer. And we hope to shoot that in studio in Belgium. And the storyline is actually I mean, accidentally, it's quite handy. It's the story about a woman. It's about a young Irish woman who's been very protected, and she ends up in a bedsit, and she can't leave the house. She can't leave the house. So she has to live her whole world in the bedsit, except at the start of the film and at the end of the film, where she has to come back and confront certain things in her life. So in that case, you know, it is conceivable that we could have effectively a European crew, which would shoot everything in the studio in Belgium, because it's very kind of stylized. It's very, very heightened. And then for the Irish material, which would be shooting in kind of Dublin or a city in possibly in the kind of west of Ireland, and then some huge landscapes which we need, and a final few shots on the Atlantic kind of coast. It is conceivable that we could, you know, that we could divide that up, because her worlds are in the script. It's part of the offering of the script. Her world is so self-enclosed. I mean, it's a kind of, it's almost, you know, like a meditation on kind of autism in a way, you know, someone who's can only see the kind of detail around her, but has been so traumatized that she can't see the big picture. That's the kind of emotional core of the story. So, you know, it is conceivable. It isn't something we've gone down the road a lot on, because at the moment things are so kind of volatile, and everyone is being, and this is really understandable, like everyone has to be, you know, everyone is trying to help, but everyone has a reflex of self-protection, and that occurs at every level, at a personal level, at a corporate level, at a cultural level, at the state level. So there is this feeling that until some people push through the door and try it, and maybe fail, you know, and, you know, try to do their best. I'm not sort of talking about anybody exploiting anybody, but I'm also talking about, you know, until we see how it's working in practice, it is hard. And insurance isn't a substitute for, you know, being kind of, you know, finding, you know, effective and clever ways to shoot things. It doesn't sort of absolve the producer of the responsibility to make sure that, you know, that individuals on the crew take personal responsibility for their behavior and kind of their actions, which I think is going to be very, very important. And it's something to which not everyone has been used to, you know, particularly in a world where so many of the crew are, you know, working for large studios on big films where they don't really have a personal investment in it. You know, to get these people to encourage them, you know, to take responsibility at a personal level for their behavior, not just on set, but their behavior when they're sort of not on set, because that's going to be important too. It's people who turn up every day for work have to be, you know, and that applies to producers, it applies to cast, it applies to everybody. So the thing that kind of, you know, I suppose frustrates me, I suppose, is fear. I think that there's a great line, I'm not sure where it kind of comes from, but it's a great line, which is, you know, fear knocks on your door. I open it, there is nobody there, you know? But it takes a huge amount of courage to open that fucking door, you know? It really does. And also one has got to be really careful. There's no point in just being, you know, like a maverick and opening it just because out of greed. I think your motives have got to be really pure before you open that door. That's it.
Okay, thanks for that. Helge, have you got anything to offer on this, on the practical planning of co-productions in the future? Do you have any sense of how that will go? What we might have to bear in mind, what we might have to change?
I think everybody's very hesitant, especially in terms of co-production. What we see, what arrives at our fund, co-productions that we have funded and are now on hold, they're all postponed for a very long period. So most of these films are pushed for a year or so. Some films are shooting in the States. We have one production that is shooting in Palestine, and so on. And you have to be really sure of the ground you're walking on when you start a co-production. And until that's the case, I think it's really complicated. So that's what I meant before when I said it's so much more difficult to work in co-productions than in domestic films, where you kind of understand what ground, even if it's a difficult ground to work on, you kind of know how to operate it and steer it. Whereas in a co-production, you're so dependent on many moving parts, and that's difficult enough to steer them in an environment that you're kind of under control and that you kind of know, but not really. But that it's sort of that used to be the risk you're willing to take when you go into a co-production. And suddenly there's an additional risk that you just can't really calculate and can't really judge. And as David says, people behave in a different way. Also, it's we had not we as a fund, but I heard of a German-Polish co-production that happened right when COVID happened and Poland closed its borders to Germany, and the dynamics in the crew were so rapidly so different, and this instinct of self-protection was very strong and sort of affected the whole experience of the film. And you need to have an atmosphere that allows creativity, and that's what we need to work towards, I think, at the moment, to create environments that allow for filmmaking and not just for troubleshooting and crisis solving.
Yeah, this is a very, very interesting point, I think. I mean, something goes back to something you said at the beginning, Rebecca, about, when you make a film, you need to be together. It just has to be that way, doesn't it? But I guess that it's a simple matter in a way with co-production. It's difficult. It's going to be problematic for all filmmaking for quite a while yet, for a number of different reasons. We haven't talked so much about the funding side of things, but from a practical point of view, certainly. And the fact is that co-productions are just much more damn expensive, or they have more cost implications, and they're just much more damn complicated. That's I think the fact that makes them that little bit more of a challenge. But Sarah, you joined us.
Just coming on, guys. Believe it or not, we've the conversation has flown past, so we've probably got about 5 or 6 minutes left on live. So I don't know if you want to kind of finish that point, Simon, and then maybe I'll throw out 1 or 2 questions.
No, I think we've talked a lot about the physical making of films and how co-productions are particularly challenged in that.
Yeah, we've had a lot of kind of similar questions around that. I think the idea of this model of crews maybe being hubbed in one spot or having to travel with the film is something that's come up. A question has come in from Rebecca. Rebecca, do you favor the idea of a trained COVID supervisor from the production department, like a production manager, or would you prefer a health and safety person who's responsible for managing the communications and protocol? Just switch on your.
Sorry. I'm all in favor of a COVID supervisor. I think that, they're going to cover the health and safety anyway by being the COVID supervisor. I think that is a good idea because they can concentrate on that particular issue. I think I will go into production definitely with that additional role. I think, the film people need to be able to get on with the job of filming, and to have somebody who's like a sort of meerkat looking around and spotting what the dangers might be as a separate permanent thing. I think certainly in the immediate future, in the next year or so, we need to have that person on board. And that's what I will definitely go for. So anybody who is a trained COVID supervisor, please get in touch with me, particularly if you're based in Scotland.
No, thank you for that, Rebecca, and thank you for that question, Adrian. Another one maybe for you, Helge, that I think might be interesting that's come in. Will countries that have managed to suppress the virus relatively successfully be more attractive for co-production than those that have not, do you think?
They might. I think Actually, they might not be necessarily for co-productions, but for service productions, it might be an interesting option. If you understand what the working conditions are and you are shifting productions towards the safest option you have, then your safest option might be a country that has managed COVID better than others. That said, managing COVID better than others is a temporary statement. We will see about second waves and so on. So I'm not sure we know what we're talking about just yet. But it might be a consideration to shift productions to territories that are sort of back on track and have managed to install working production units and so on.
It may just be a case that countries that have managed to react in terms of their audiovisual sector more positively to manage the co-production or manage maybe the more attractive rather than countries in general that have managed the outbreak. So again, we'll probably look at it on a case-by-case basis based on a country's reaction within their audiovisual sector, perhaps. Rebecca, just one that's come in about the 1.57 or 1.75 billion that the UK has announced for culture and arts fundings. Do you think this will be open for film and co-production?
I'm not sure it is open for film. I think that it's basically for the cultural section. It's going to be for theatres. It's going to be for cinemas, yes, but actual production, I don't believe so. I mean, I think we're treated like any other business. So no, but we are looking for, I mean, I think the key thing is looking out for an announcement regarding insurance. I think that that's the way filming will start. I mean, again, as I said before, the studios look after themselves, but we can't. And the independent sector is basically buggered until we get to the insurance thing sorted out. And that has to be the priority. And it's not part of this package as far as I know. I haven't looked at it in great detail yet, but it doesn't seem to be there. Great.
And David, one comment that came in from our friend Ashley Horner, our ACE producer as well, that 3 slates is a house, or 3 slates is a roof. But also another question that came in from Patrick O'Mahony, just for you, what makes a co-production attractive to you as a producer? And maybe will your way of considering co-productions, maybe in the short term particularly, be affected?
The answer to that is no. I mean, I think it just has to be something which excites me. It was really interesting. This producer that I'm working with in Italy on this Irish movie, he sent me an Irish project last week, which I hadn't even heard about. And it's just fantastic. And you know what I mean? So it's an Irish interest one. So, and it's completely different. I don't think anything like this has been made before. And obviously that is what interests me. You know, it's a bit like I'm an independent producer. Therefore, you know, the thing which excites me is to make something that I've never made before.
Okay, I think we're about to get cut off, lads. We've got the 1 hour sharp. So Simon, I just want to hand back to you in case there's anything you want to say.
In a few seconds that's difficult. No, I can't do that. But, I think it's been, I hope it's been interesting. It's certainly been interesting for me. And I think, yeah, we could have done with longer, but never mind.
Yeah, I think this is only the start of the conversations we say. And I think, you know, there's a lot of things that we need to sort out, particularly insurance, which has come across very strongly. But I want to say a huge thank you to Simon, to Helge, to David and Rebecca for giving us an hour of their time today and their great insights. And I want to say a huge thank you to everybody as well who joined us today. I think we had over 100 viewers on this. So again, thank you everybody for being involved. And we look forward to continuing this conversation either virtually or hopefully in person at some point in the future soon. And continue that very strong tradition of co-production that we have in Europe and in Ireland in particular. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.